Newsrooms were these crazy universities full of experts on the strangest things, people with real understanding and experience of things that mattered, places where you could ask anybody anything, though you might get your head bitten off if you interrupted someone on a deadline. You've also got company, noise, yahooing and jokes. I discovered I'm made for that kind of place. The words of David Marr strangely sounds exactly like the National Library. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the National Library of Australia, particularly for you in the theatre with us tonight who have braved the cold. Thank you for coming along to this very special event, Upheaval, Disrupted Lives in Journalism. My name is Stuart Baines, and I'm the Director of Community Engagement at the National Library of Australia. I'd like to acknowledge Australia's First Nations people as the traditional owners and custodians of this land and give my respects to their elders, past and present, and through them to all Australian Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. We're thrilled to have you all here tonight for this conversation about Upheaval, Disrupted Lives in Journalism. Welcome to all the people watching on our stream or through our YouTube channel, and I do not judge you for not braving the cold. Upheaval was born from the Australian Research Council project known as New Beats and brings together material from interviews with 57 journalists who, with one exception, experienced redundancy between 2012 and 2016. These whole-of-life interviews were recorded in association with the National Library and cover regional, rural and metropolitan journalists from radio, TV, online and print media. To bring to life the work encapsulated in this book, we have here tonight Matthew Ricketson, Catherine Murphy, Steve Lewis and Mark Peaver. My introductions will be brief so we can get to the main event, so apologies in advance to our panel tonight. Matthew Ricketson is an academic and journalist. He is Professor of Communication at Deakin University and has worked at The Age, The Australian and Times Australia, among others. He, along with Andrew Dodd, edited Upheaval, taking on the mammoth task of distilling the many hours of interviews which resulted in 4,885 pages of transcripts into a 360-page book. Catherine Murphy has worked in Canberra's Parliamentary Press Gallery since 1996 for the Australian Financial Review, The Australian, The Age, before joining The Guardian Australia, where she is political editor. She won the Paul Walkley Award for Excellence in Press Gallery Journalism in 2008 and in 2012. She was a Walkley Award finalist in the Digital Journalism category. Steve Lewis, who is joining us online tonight, is a best-selling author and former senior journalist in the Canberra Press Gallery. He worked as a political reporter for the Australian Financial Review, The Australian and News Corp Metro papers, and is currently senior advisor at Newgate Communications. You might also recognise his name from the political thrillers he co-authored with Chris Uhlmann, two of which were adapted into the television program Secret City. Steve Lewis is one of the journalists who was interviewed for the project and is featured in Upheaval. Mark Peaver is the Assistant Director of Technical Acquisitions and Finance. He has worked in the library's oral history section for a number of years and was one of the key team members who worked on the New Beats project. Please join me in welcoming Matthew Ricketson, Catherine Murphy, Steve Lewis and Mark Peaver for Upheaval, Disrupted Lives in Journalism.
Well, thank you so much for that really kind and comprehensive introduction. And also, I'm really sorry, just at a personal level, to be looking at Steve Lewis on a screen rather than with us here at the library. But anyway, that's the COVID world, isn't it? And I'm very grateful that you've all come out this evening for this conversation about this really important book that my friend Matthew pulled together to basically document the experiences of journalism at a really sort of interesting time. Just so I can sort of join some dots, just so how we all know one another, Matthew and I worked together at The Age, and we've collaborated since with him being a proper academic and me and been periodically doing various things at the margins. Steve and I worked together in my first journalism job at the Australian Financial Review. We were in the Canberra Bureau together for a number of years, and we also worked together at the Australian for a couple of years, and we've served on the National Press Club board at various times together as well. So these two are very important associates of mine. Mark, I don't know, but I will very much enjoy his insights into the conversation this evening. So we're just going to kick off. Obviously, we got a general view about what Upheaval is about and the project around Upheaval, but Matthew, why don't you kick us off by taking people through the genesis of this particular project?
Sure. Thank you for that, Catherine. And yeah, it's a real pleasure to be here tonight. We have been trying to hold this event for some time. We've been, Steve's been cruelled by COVID, but the launching of this project up here at the library has also been cruelled by that beforehand. Look, it's actually by coincidence, it is actually 10 years ago this week that Fairfax Media, as it was then known, took what, as far as we could see, was the unprecedented step in its history of large-scale redundancies across the whole company. 1,900 jobs in all, but that included lots of people other than journalists. But it was about 20% of the journalistic workforce at Fairfax Media at the time. And then 2 days later, Kim Williams, the then chief executive of News Limited, as they were then known, announced also very large redundancies, refused to say how many people were going, but gradually that information has been pieced together over the years. So it was a real shockwave in the media landscape at the time, and only a few months before, media chiefs had been saying to anyone, look, everything's fine, we're not going to suffer the same sorts of issues that are going on in England or in the United States, that our business model is fine, until it wasn't. And we now know comprehensively that the business model was having significant problems. One of the ways the companies tried to deal with that was to engage in large-scale redundancies. Some people then, decided to go happily. They were kind of in their 60s, they were nearing retirement, so they got a very nice big payout to kind of leave. Other people were well in the, people like Steve were right in the swing of their journalistic career, and so, they had a different kind of decision to make. Some people went off into public relations, some people went off and worked at universities, some people, fell into a funk, quite frankly, and didn't know what to do. And so myself and colleagues at a number of universities, Andrew Dodd, who's a co-editor of the book with me, but also Laurie Zion at La Trobe Uni, Merryn Sherwood at La Trobe, Tim Marjoribanks at Swinburne, and Penny O'Donnell at Sydney University, we all kind of serendipitously decided this was a project that needed to be done. And so we started trying to work out what impact is this going to have on the people who are leaving journalism, maybe, because at that stage we didn't know where they were going, and what impact is this going to be having on the news media industry as a whole. And we've spent, now a number of years documenting that in a number of different ways, whether for academic articles or books like this, or an academic monograph which, looks at the more, academic issues and looks at them in comparison with international events and so on. So it's been a big project over a number of years, and even in that 10-year period, things have changed enormously. We were trying to chart it as the kind of, well, you'd be familiar with this problem, as the ground was kind of shifting underneath us. So, yes.
And Steve, why did you, two questions, why did you choose to participate in this oral history project? Why was it important to you to tell your story, and also perhaps for the folks here and watching on at home virtually, why don't you describe the journalism of your era?
Thanks, Catherine. And I'm sorry I can't be there tonight. I was very much looking forward to appearing, but yeah, alas, I got struck by COVID last Saturday after flying in from Europe. So I'm here in Sydney at home. So I spent about 25 years in journalism. I came to it late. I was 28 years old when I was employed by Jerry Noonan, who was the then editor of the Financial Review, as a cadet. And I'd been to university, I went to UTS, but started late. I think I was 26 years old and was flirting with the political career at the time, but then stepped into journalism. So fast forward, so I spent 25 years in the business until I was made redundant. I wasn't part of that big wave of mass redundancies. In my case, I was made redundant. I was working for News Corp at the time, and I was, I had a senior political reporting role in the Canberra Press Gallery, as you recall, working for the group, all of the tabloids. But I was, in a sense, I was a victim of the internal News Corp politics, because Kim Williams, who you mentioned, Matthew, before, Kim had been brought in to run news, but he fell foul of the News Corp editors, who were incredibly powerful at the time, people like Chris Mitchell and Paul Whitaker. And what Kim tried to do was to bring all of the various News Corp mastheads together and to consolidate them. So instead of having 12 sports reporters across 12 mastheads, you'd have a small group of, say, 3 or 4 who could report for various mastheads. And I was sort of part of that cohort. But when Kim left the company, the editors basically got control back of their mastheads, and so I was made redundant. So it was a pretty wild ride for me, 25 years. And when Matthew approached me, I can't remember exactly when, Matthew, but several years later, to participate in this, I thought it was a very good idea, because in journalism, I didn't feel that I had a chance to really draw a breath over those 25 years. When I left journalism in late 2013, I took a 6-month sabbatical, and it was a wonderful opportunity to breathe, to consider what I would do next. And so this, I thought, was a good opportunity to reflect on, my journalistic career, but also the changes that I had seen over that 25 years from 88 to 2013.
And obviously you've left the profession, Steve, but you're still connected in terms of your work in communications, and you obviously remain a keen observer of, your former zone. What do you think are sort of the principal differences between journalism as it's practiced now, now that we've really sort of gone right through the internet transformation now, and we're sort of almost entering another upswing, which we could get into, I think, probably a bit later. What are the differences, do you think?
Yeah, I'm still very heavily involved in journalism. I mean, Rosie, my daughter's working for the Oz in the Press Gallery, so she continues that tradition, if you like. And I spend far too much time on the phone each day talking to your colleagues in the Press Gallery, Catherine, about all sorts of things, including my job at Newgate. So when you and I worked together, you joined the Fin in 96, right? I got to Canberra in 1992, working for the Financial Review. And for the first 6-7 years in the Canberra Press Gallery, I covered policy. I wasn't a political reporter, I was a policy reporter. And you remember that I covered communications policy, industry policy, transport policy, etc. The biggest change between then and now in journalism is that we don't have policy specialists. You used to have a half a dozen health reporters, or every bureau in Canberra had a defence reporter, an education reporter, communications reporter, and they would cover those particular policies and cover them forensically. But now, with very few exceptions, you don't have policy specialists. The mastheads don't have the resources, unfortunately, and the bureaus. I mean, some of them are still significant. News Corp's still got a significant bureau, not as big as it used to be. Guardian, of course. I mean, you've built up. Guardian's one of the few success stories in journalism over the past decade or so. But most of the big mastheads don't have the same resources. So the biggest change is you don't have the policy specialists that you used to have. The other really, really, really big change, which I've noticed, or which is clearly obvious, is that the emergence of social media has changed social media has changed journalism, and it means now that journalists, just about all journalists, but have to build a brand around social media, and I think that has had a huge impact on the quality, the quantity, the nature of journalism. I think, unfortunately, I think far too many journalists spend their time working on their profile, their social media profile, rather than doing, doing the fundamentals and doing the fundamentals well. So I think the emergence of social media has had a huge impact. I mean, it's had a huge impact on society, right? Massive impact on the political landscape. It's impacted on the capacity of us as a country, as a society, to have nuanced, layered debates on just about any issue. But it's had a huge impact, I think, on journalism as a whole.
And to Mark now, obviously the library has collaborated on this project, this really interesting project. It's basically an oral history. Why did the library consider that it was important really to record the histories of people like Steve and a number of others who are profiled obviously in the book?
Yeah, no, thanks, Catherine. So in terms of what we do in the library, we have an oral history collection that dates back to the 1950s. We've been collecting since then. We have over 56,000 hours, and we have the largest oral history collection in the world to do with the Australian people. And so we're always interested in looking at ways to expand that and to bring in more stories. And I think this project is an excellent example of a really strong collaboration between a research group and us, because it not only focuses on a specific time in social history of journalists, but also it covers many other important themes, such as change and resilience across a group of people. With this, we were able to assist in the recording of 60 interviews, which means there's like 286 hours of content there. And it's really broad. As Stuart indicated in the introduction, we've got a really wide range of people. And it just meant that it was just such a valuable opportunity that we thought it was something that we should take up on.
Okay, and we were talking about this before you lovely folks came in. It's I'm curious because to my mind the history of journalism is this rolling history of technological disruption. If you think about our origins as radical pamphlets, sort of, back in the early printing press days, through the onset of sort of mass market commercial journalism, both in print, on television, another major disruption, radio, all these other mediums, and then through to the internet. I'm curious about what it is about the sort of the internet-related disruption to our profession that sort of warrants this level of study.
Well, I think we've been interviewing sort of people from the journalism field for a while. So we do have in our collection journalists as well as cartoonists and photographers, that sort of thing. But I think it's just this project, because it does have that multi-dimensionality to it, it means that not only are we capturing an event, but we're also capturing a group of people as well. And I think one of the things which is mentioned in the towards the back of the book is the style that we do here of interviewing is called whole of life, which is probably very different to the standard journalistic kind of approach, in that when we talk to people or when we interview them, although, as in this case, there is a specific focus that we'd like someone to talk about, what we'd really like is them as a person. We want to have a real insight into what made them the people they are. And although you made certain decisions or acted in certain ways, why, how, what is the makeup of you that meant you did come to that conclusion or made those decisions. And the beauty of this collection and using whole-of-life interviewing techniques with this is that not only do we have an incredibly rich collection to do with this event, it also means that we have now narratives that can be woven amongst all the other narratives within the collection. So that way, if you're researching or even listening, you can weave common threads through the entire collection. And in terms of the reason why this was important too is along with being approached. So in terms of collaborations like this, what will happen is the research group will come to us, and there's a really great complementary arrangement where you're providing your expertise and being able to, because you're leaders in the field of the knowledge, you're able to guide us in terms of people who should be interviewed, and we can provide support in terms of, how's that sample going to be constructed? How do we get proper representation? Because although we'd love to interview everyone, we can't. So we work with you to make sure that there's enough of the makeup there. But then along with that, we also provide all the technical support as well. So we have studio-grade field recording equipment, which we trained all the interviewers in. And we looked after those recordings. They're now safely stored in our archive. But also we enable the delivery of those interviews all around the world. And, of that 56,000 hours I mentioned, 25% of that collection is available online. And even of this collection, we've got 22 interviews, which people can listen to right now for free through Trove and our catalogue. So, it's a really fantastic way to be involved and also to collect. And also I think the distance of time as well, Steve, you brought up the ability to reflect. One of the things with oral history is that it's not an immediate thing, it takes time. And although the events happened in 2012, 2013, many of the interviews weren't started until 5 years later. And that means that it allows the interviewee to reflect and process what has happened. So, again, lending a richer interview.
Something to that, because that's all of those things we absolutely found in doing the project. It was also whole of life, which was a term that we weren't familiar with, which we are now very familiar with. But what has come through in the book is it's both constructed chronologically and also thematically. And so while we might, if you like, as journalists have been focusing on the big event, that is a large scale redundancies and their effect, by doing a whole of life interview and starting with, whether it was with Steve or with David Marr or Sophie Tedmanson or Gillian Lord or whomever, we started with, well, how did you know or think or want to get into journalism? What led you to that? How did you get into the industry? What was your first byline, that first big moment when you realised you could do this? What sort of ethical kind of sticky issues did you encounter? Did you encounter reporting on really difficult traumatic events which might have had an effect on you? So all of those sorts of, if you like, events and issues that occur in the workplace. I should add actually another one which was really quite striking during the research was the amount of sexual harassment that occurred in newsrooms back then, and even, as we know, sadly to a degree today. That really came through with some really quite, horrible stories about things that people, particularly women, had to endure. So all of that is part of the whole of life. And then, there's a lot of reflections, as you say, on how did the industry come to the point where it felt it needed to do all these redundancies? How did people receive that information? Because it was shocking for a lot of people and quite brutal. And how did you react? Steve took a sabbatical, and some people did something like that, but they also, they were just knocked sideways by having been in that kind of daily crush of journalism, day after day after day, and then you're suddenly not. And so what do you do now? And some of them, as we just kind of discuss later in the book, they went into other paths, et cetera, et cetera. So I should have mentioned earlier on, one of the people involved in the project was Brad Buller, who took that massive amount of material that was gathered and did a whole lot of what we called chunking, where he'd take, here's everything that was in the interviews about your first byline, or here's everything that was in the interviews about sexual harassment or whatever, and break that down for each of the other members of the team who wrote chapters. And Brad, in fact, wrote one himself as well. So it was a very complicated editing process. And just to give you one small example, because we have slices of people's lives. We've got 3 people who we profiled, if you like, and they're Amanda Mead, who now works at The Guardian but used to work at The Australian, David Marr, who's been mentioned already, and Flip Pryor, who's now at the ABC but began over in the West as a reporter. Those profile sections in the book are 4,000 words, but I know because I did the David Marr interview, the transcript is 26,000 words long. So the editing process was really difficult, but the kind of pleasure, if anyone wants to, is there is 25,000 words or 6 hours if you want to listen to David Marr's entire career, or indeed Steve's. I think Steve, from memory, was about 4.5 hours. I think we did. I can't remember exactly, but it's all there if you want to go and listen to all of it, or you can, there's bits and pieces, if you like, of Steve cut up and all sprinkled through the book. And in the case of David Marr, there's a big chunk, a 4,000-word chunk. So there's a variety of ways that you can kind of come at it.
I know a number of people who would line up to have the 26,000 word version of the David Marr transcript. Steve, I want to ask you, just to Mark's point, that obviously there was a bit of a lag, right, between when you left journalism and when you participated in this interview. So you were able to filter and process and all of that sort of stuff. Like, I'll just ask the idiot journalist question. Obviously, we do a lot of interviewing in our line of work. We're not interviewed that often. So what was it like to be interviewed for this process rather than being on the other side of it? And also, what do you think that that time lag might have given you in terms of the storytelling about your own experiences, right? Like, obviously, when the redundancy happened, that was an awful lot for you to take in. And there were a whole spectrum of emotions associated with that. I'm not personalising this to you, obviously. I mean, I just know that so many of our colleagues, right, went through all the spectrums of emotions about this. So it's sort of like, so to distill the question, 1, what was it like being interviewed as opposed to asking the questions? And 2, what do you reckon the passage of time did, or gave you as the sort of storyteller of your own professional experience?
Yeah, thanks, Catherine. I enjoyed being interviewed. It was, in fact, I went back and listened to not all, but some of the interview the other day, and it was a very comprehensive interview. I recall speaking with Matthew at the library, and starting with my early life growing up in Sydney through to university, and then through to journalism. So it was that whole of life approach. I enjoyed being interviewed. And I've done quite a bit of publicity over the years, particularly promoting the novels that I wrote with Chris Ullman, and I've always enjoyed that process, to be honest. So I didn't feel uncomfortable, but I think, and to your sort of second point as well, I think it was, 4 years or so from the time I was made redundant in late 2013 to the time that I was interviewed by Matthew. Is that correct? Was it 2017? Maybe a bit earlier, Matthew.
No, 2017 is when we did the interview. Yep.
Yeah, right, okay. So that was about 4 years. So it gave you a chance to, I guess, reflect and think back about, those 25 years, the good, the bad, and the ugly, and there was fair bit of all of that in my journalistic career, and to sort of reflect back on it. So it was a really, really good opportunity, and I think it's really positive to talk about these particular issues, talk about journalism. I like talking about journalism as a profession, because I care about it very deeply, and I think it's obviously very, very important. And there's a lot about journalism that I'm not all that fond of, frankly, at the moment. So it is a very useful process to do that.
I'm conscious that we're up against it time-wise, and I'm just putting in the mind of folks here that, of course, we would like to take a couple of questions from you for any of the panellists here this evening. But I think we probably just need to do a little bit of quick reflection on what's happened since, in essence. Matthew situated us right at the beginning in that period in Fairfax where there were mass redundancies, a period when, just again, before you folks arrived, Matthew said, do you realise it's 10 years almost to the day of those mass redundancies at Fairfax, and I remember that like it was yesterday, and the months that followed, and the trauma that inflicted on the organisation, which is hard to actually even still talk about without getting emotional. So that was, let's just say, those years where we felt we were in free fall professionally, where I, as a practicing journalist, thought in 2012, maybe we've got another 5 years of life, if I'm lucky. We are past that now. We're not, and I don't think we will ever return to, the golden years, which sadly I missed. I think that's impossible. I don't think we will see that industrial scale journalism again, because I don't think there's a viable business model for it. But we have rebounded somewhat off the lows of that period that were genuinely existential for the industry and for practitioners in Australia. So Matthew, where are we now, do you think, compared to, when those emails arrived?
Well, it did. I think it is important to recall it did get pretty grim. Not only that seismic kind of shock, but for several years afterwards. I don't remember how many years exactly, but I'd say 5, 6, 7.
Yeah.
There was no cadet intake at what became the 9 newspapers, which historically it was kind of an annual seasonal event. Both for people wanting to get into journalism, and if you're in my shoes now in a university preparing students to get into journalism, it's that kind of annual event. It kind of didn't happen for several years, and it kind of got to the point where it really felt so many of the media outlets were so thin that they almost couldn't get worse, and there seemed to be a realisation we're actually we're not just hacking off fat here, we're kind of slicing into bone, and it's really affecting what we think we're doing, which is providing journalism to the public. And then, you would have known and reported on many of the inquiries that have gone on into the media, Senate inquiries and so on. There's been an almost annual event for several years. The ACCC, the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission, led by Rod Sims, was charged by the former Treasurer, Scott Morrison, to inquire into this as an issue seriously. And they did some original research, and they came up with what they called the News Media Bargaining Code. And that's a whole other seminar, kind of, if you like, in itself. So I won't bore you with all of that for the moment. But the key point that came out of it was that the money that had left the industry, Sims found a way for some of that money to come back to the industry. Okay, that's the key point. And that's the code enabled that to happen. As I said, there are significant other issues to be discussed, but we probably don't have time for them now. But that's the key point. So as of last year, the beginning, I think, of last year, both Facebook and Google, who have been the main kind of villains of the piece, you know, sucking all this money out of not only in Australia but elsewhere, they've been doing deals with various media outlets to give some money back to them, nominally for kind of affecting their ability to earn money from their journalism. So Guardian Australia, and Catherine, you can talk to this much more than I can, but you know, there's money that's gone into Guardian Australia, which has meant a good number of journalists have been able to be employed, and the same has been true at Nine, at News, at Crikey, for example, run by private media. Where else? I think at the Schwartz Media, which publishes the monthly and also publishes the Saturday paper, and so on. So there's some estimates range from $200 million a year to $300 million a year have come into the industry, and you know, you hope most of it's being spent on journalistic resources and enabling that. So there is actually more resources around. You know, I know there have been reflections by a number of people about the quality of reporting that occurred during the recent federal election. You know, some pretty harsh criticisms of that, and so there's some questions to be asked about that for us as a profession, as an industry. But there is certainly more money coming in, and you know, you can see the fruits of that in a number of really good reporting projects that have been occurring.
And you know, as an adjunct to that, obviously news organisations have sought more viable business strategies from the paywalls that existed at the Oz, which is, you know, and the Fin Review, where Steve and I worked together, to our model at Guardian Australia, which is a sort of a reader revenue model, where we invite people to you know, become members in essence, but we keep all our journalism open. So it's sort of been a combination of you know, not giving away content for free, which is what we did in the opening stages of the transition, coupled with the News Media Bargaining Code, injecting some revenue back into organisations, which has been helpful to sort of just putting a floor under the free fall. Now, again, I will come to questions from you guys just for a second, but I just want to conclude by asking you two, Steve, Matthew, what do you think? Because this is obviously, Upheaval is obviously the story of the people who left. What do you think the people who stayed make of the story of the people who left? Steve, you want to kick off?
I think there's a lot of... It's a hard question in a way, Catherine. I think there's... are you asking me to sort of give my sense as to how people who are still working in journalism feel about those who left?
Well, it's not at some visceral personal level. I just mean, you know, this history encapsulates a journalistic world that both continues to exist but is also past. So it's, what do you reckon that, you know, that people who didn't leave, who staggered through the digital transition, you know, make of these reflections of the bygone world? It's not really a fair question, but I think it's an interesting one.
Those brave souls like yourself who are
well, no, it's not a humble brag on my part. I mean, I'm genuinely interested.
That's an interesting point. I mean, my sense is, talking to a lot of journalists in the press gallery and elsewhere, that I think journalists feel a lot more under pressure, a lot more stressed. I don't think there's the sense of camaraderie that there used to be. I mean, I think those opening remarks, which were attributed to David Marr, you know, sort of had, you know, the newsrooms of yesteryear. They were more sort of exciting. There were more people. There were a lot more people in the newsrooms, and there was that, you know, greater camaraderie. I mean, just, people are able to enjoy themselves more. I think the pressures now of 24/7 journalism, the fact that journalists are, when I was working in the press gallery in the 90s, Catherine, with you at the Fin Review, there was a sort of a daily symmetry to the journalism. You'd start mid-morning, you'd finish around about 7 p.m. at night, and it was pretty much the same. It was a stock standard day, but it's just so much. It's sort of much wilder now, and people are having less fun. And I think we're talking about. You mentioned the last federal election. I think that was, to me, looking at it from the sidelines, it was journalists. Often people hadn't spent a lot of years as journalists, but they were trying to. The gotcha questions reflected the fact that people were trying to build their profile and what have you, or felt that they had to sort of build their profile on social media rather than actually sticking to the craft. So I don't know. My sense is that a lot of people I speak to who are journalists, senior journalists across the media, I don't get the sense that people are really happy with the profession. So do they look at people who've left with a bit of a sense of, I wish I'd taken that redundancy check as well, a bit of I don't know. It's a hard one to answer.
Matthew?
Well, the first thing is, apart from asking you that question, Catherine, I haven't spoken to lots of younger people in newsrooms, so I don't. Perhaps that's the next project. But what they're thinking about this, but what I would really hope for is that they do actually, and not just because I want the book to be read, but I do think one of the things we say in the book is that there's a lot of what is called practical wisdom. There's a lot of, within journalism, both in the past and I dare say in the present, because it's all done, in the day of the moment, problem here, solve problem, right problem, etc. You solve problems under a great deal of pressure. You develop a good deal of practical wisdom in terms, whether it's researching skills, writing skills, working out legal issues, working out ethical issues, and so on. There's a lot of stored wisdom, and I hope one of the things I don't think we necessarily aim to do this openly, but what really comes through is there's this huge amount of stored wisdom in here of how to do good journalism, how to avoid doing bad journalism, how to recognise if you've mucked something up, and so on. And so rather than necessarily read another textbook or not classes are fine, but there's lots of interesting material and valuable material in here which whether it was Rosie, your daughter, or other younger journalists, you think, oh, that's how it was done. It doesn't mean we have to go back and do it the way it was done then, but there are certain kind of perennial things that go through. You do have to find a story. You do have to write a story. You do have to make sure you don't get yourself into legal hot water, and so on. Those things have not been changed by the internet, those fundamentals. And so I hope that, that would happen, and then there can be a really useful dialogue between younger people who are, as Amanda Mead says in her profile, incredibly not only savvy about the internet, but really good at working with different platforms and knitting them together and so on. Those skills, and those other skills that people from an earlier age had, talk to each other about them and learn from each other rather than do the, these people, young people today, or you old fuddy-duddies or whatever, which is a, conversation that ends up in a dry gulch very quickly. I think there's a really rich conversation to be had among journalists and within newsrooms about what's in there already.
Very good. Who's got a question? Oh, lots. Gosh. I think we've got a microphone coming, just down here in the front.
We do have a microphone coming in for the benefit of those watching the stream at home. Please wait for the microphone and for the benefit of those using the hearing loop.
Okay, you've distilled a whole lot of interviews down into 246 pages, was it?
300 and...
Oh, sorry, 340.
That's right, 360, but
360 pages, okay. You must have heard some stories in there. You haven't told any stories tonight about
funny you should mention
things that journalists said.
That's poor moderation.
That's part... No. That's part A of the question. Part B is, what sort of conclusions do you come to? I mean, what does your analysis of all this distillation, of poring over transcripts, what general conclusions have you come to about the state of the industry?
Okay, let me start with the story. There is one, I'll just read it to you. This is Simon Mann, who used to be the deputy editor of The Age, began as down in Victoria, in Anglesea, in country Victoria, working on the local paper there, desperate to get onto a big city paper, and went to what was then the Sun News Pictorial, now the Herald Sun, and he talks about he had a friend in journalism who'd kind of recommended him to the editor, a guy by the name of Lee Stevens. He went to meet him in his office one night at 11 o'clock, after, in between editions as they were coming out, and he sat there, and Stevens was very pleasant, and he sat opposite me. This is direct from Simon, and he started to ask things, and then he said to me, "Look, I've got to be honest with you, I don't know what Jeff Eastdown said to you, but all we've got here is a job going in the finance section, shares, money, that sort of shit. I didn't really take this in, but I was keen for a job," and I said, "Look, that's fine, Mr. Stevens. I'm really keen to come and have a crack at the Metro paper, so I don't mind. But I have to be honest with you, I failed fourth form maths and dropped out of economics at university." And there was a pause. And Stevens tapped his cigarette before lighting it, and he took a long draw, and he said, "Terrific, when can you start?" That was about 1983 or 84. So, so that's, there are lots and lots of stories. I'm very happy to say there's lots and lots of stories in the book like that, and sad stories, etc. as well. The general conclusions, okay, so apart from some of the things we've already said, or I've already said, and Steve's already talked about, one of we wrote the very final section, we wrote, trying to do the conclusion, we wrote that right in the shadow of the 6th of January 2021, the riots at the Capitol. And if you'll indulge me for a moment, I'll read a little bit of that, the last bit, because that, in a sense, I think goes to your question. It's possible to harness the best from the past while rising to the new challenges of the present and the future. It's a cliche to say we need good journalism now more than ever, but you can see why we've been hearing it a lot lately. Look at the events of the Capitol in Washington on the 6th of January. It's hard to fathom that so many Americans continue to believe the lies Donald Trump told about the presidential election result, and that some of them planned an assault that came close to lynching the Democrat Speaker of the House and the Republican Vice President. We know this level of detail because journalists told us, just as they informed us about the 30,000 plus lies Trump told during his presidency, as well as his attacks on democratic institutions and failure to combat COVID-19. That many Americans did not see these stories or chose to reject them has a lot to do with how social media has been used to distort and misinform. It may also help explain why 74 million Americans voted for Trump. But surely a key reason why more than 81 million voted for Joe Biden is the work reporters did to hold Trump's presidency to account. Journalism is central to a healthy democracy. That's why we need to keep saying it matters now more than ever. So that's the kind of conclusion of the book. And I'm happy to stand by that as a conclusion and hopefully as an answer to your question.
Okay, who else?
Hi. I've been reading about how the Tories and Ofcom are trying to rip the guts out of BBC, basically. They don't want the BBC to be reporting news. They don't want them paying for having their taxpayer funded going to news media. Do you think there's some sort of validity in that? Do you think the Australian government shouldn't be paying the ABC to report on news?
Short answer, no. I think the Australian government should be funding the ABC to do exactly that.
I could add just a supplementary. Look, obviously I'm a massive fan of the ABC and I appear on many ABC programs. And I think the really precious thing about the ABC in our media landscape at this point in time is that research demonstrates that the ABC still commands an audience from people of all political persuasions. It's sort of like, if you think about the digital media landscape as sort of, you know, a plain littered by campfires of various types that people gather around, well, the ABC is a really precious media asset in this country because it exists outside of, you know, what I would describe as the Balkans of the rest of the media landscape, where a lot of readership is driven by confirmation bias rather than open-minded inquiry. So I think it's very important. I would also say, though, as a person who has worked exclusively in the commercial media landscape, never for the ABC, that it is extremely difficult for commercial media operations to compete, particularly in that free fall period that I was talking about, against a well-resourced public broadcaster that could cover the field in ways that the commercial media were unable to do, particularly during that point of real bearing down pressure on our operations. So while I absolutely support the ABC and will defend it to my dying breath because of its contribution to the country and the polity and the democracy, I would also say on behalf of myself and my other commercial media colleagues that it does make it difficult. Up the back.
Just to pick up on an earlier point about the US politics, does anyone on the panel see us going down the same path in terms of the recent reports of many journalists being threatened, intimidated, bullied, harassed, pepper sprayed and so on, even by law enforcement officials? Is that because of America's polarised climate, or does anyone see that happening possibly in Australia, where it becomes sort of like an occupational hazard to put up with those sort of threats and intimidation?
Do you want to pick that up?
Sure. Some of that already does happen here. If you do watch Media Watch on the ABC, you may remember that the opening credits show 2 or 3 incidents recently of Australian journalists being attacked by various mobs, whether it was people protesting about COVID restrictions or other things. I do think there is a difference between what's been happening in America and what's been happening here, but there is also some of that bleeding into our body politic as well, which I really don't think is a welcome thing at all.
Yeah. Well, I can say from somebody who covered the COVID protests in Canberra that there was a lot about that environment that was quite intimidating for a working reporter. So, you know, there are, and, you know, look, it's obviously there's a particular dynamic in the US, which means that the polarisation of that polity is a lot further down the derangement path than Australia, fortunately. But, you know, all the conditions exist here which could lead to an accelerated set of circumstances that would not make life here much different from the States. And this is something that we have to be vigilant about, and you know, it's why, you know, I think it's important for people to invest psychically and practically in the great precious democracy that we have in this country and participate in civic life with a degree of duty of care for, you know, because there is this coarsening of discourse and the threat environment both for politicians and for working journalists is increasing. So I think if we care about democracy, and that's the reason I do what I do, we need to be very vigilant about that.
Hi. In the not too distant past, I worked as an archivist and librarian at the ABC in the TV newsroom in Sydney. I left a few years ago because even then I could see that the changes have just been announced in terms of cutting staff, that was on the cards back then. I didn't like what that meant for my profession, but I didn't like what it meant for journalism as well. And I'm just interested to hear from the panel on your thoughts about what impact it's likely to have, not just the cutting of archives and library staff, but sort of all the roles that support journalism. So just interested to hear on your reflections of that, please.
I should just cue Steve in Sydney too. Obviously, love if you want to chime in here, please do. Yep. So, archives, Matthew?
Yeah, I'm in heated agreement with you. It's a problem. And you would have seen just recently there's some further jobs in the archives area at the ABC that are going to be cut. I have heard the ABC chair, Ita Buttrose, interviewed on that, and she said that some of those jobs would be replaced, like some of them were going, but some of them there would be some new ones coming in, and the people who were there could apply for the newer ones. This is a fairly familiar story in the media in the last 10 years, as you know. But look, two things. I do think I haven't seen it satisfactorily explained yet why it appears there's less importance being placed on archives. Now, I think Ita Buttrose did say that was not the case, but I haven't seen it satisfactorily explained how that can be when I don't think this is the first batch of people from the archives who've been cut. I think this is a story that's been going for some time. You probably know it much better than I do, but so there's that. And the question about roles that support journalism is a kind of very under-told but very important story. Like I am an ABC watcher, so I do notice that every evening if I'm watching something, there is archival footage in a story, and it so enriches so many stories to see the Harbour Bridge 40 years ago, 50 years ago, or to see how families were living 30, 40, 50 years ago, the housing prices and all of that sort of thing. It's absolutely vital kind of celluloid fabric, if you like, for us as a nation. So it is really important, and it's I don't think journalists, if there is some suggestion that journalists are going to do this archiving themselves, apart from howls of derisive laughter, Bruce, the two jobs are separate and different. They should be respected for their differences. But secondly, just even if journalists do want to do a lot of archiving, I think there are some really practical problems when the journalist's job is, as I said, find the story, do the story, get the story out, and then move to the next story immediately. So how that fits with the steady, thorough, meticulous archiving, I can't see. As I said, I can't see it. Hasn't been satisfactorily explained as far as I can see. And it is very, very important. I completely agree.
Just quickly, it's sort of, the troubling thing about it is it's sort of a further diminution of our role journalistically as being the first draft of history. It's sort of, I had a practical experience of this myself recently where, because I've contributed a chapter to a book that Julia Gillard is editing on the 10th anniversary of her misogyny speech. And I went back as a reporter to try and find a record of the live political blog I did on the day for Fairfax, because I wanted to basically look at what I'd written on the day and critically assess how stupid I was, basically. And I had real trouble actually tracking that down. I found it eventually, but it wasn't easy. And, there's the sort of, Mark may have a perspective on this from a history perspective. There are all the reasons that Matthew's outlined about why that celluloid memory or that written memory is really important in a first draft sense or an ongoing reflective sense, but also just in a practical legal sense. The news organisations are supposed to keep records for a significant period of time because obviously, cases can be litigated years after the fact. And, and if there is this tendency in news organisations to think, record keeping's no longer important, well, then we really are up shit creek. Are we on time or can we do one more? One more.
You spoke earlier about the fact that in political reporting there used to be policy specialists. What do you think that we as news consumers have lost with the loss of those specialist reporters? Is it a lack of scrutiny, or what are your thoughts on, I guess, for everyday people, what that lack of insight potentially has created?
Steve, do you want to lead on this one? This was your point.
Yeah, thanks, Catherine. Yeah. Well, it has led to much less scrutiny of particular areas. I mean, it means that journalists are more generalists, if you like. And I mean, defence is, I think, a very good example. There are still some very, very good defence and national security reporters in the press gallery working for the ABC, for News Corp, for Fairfax, etc., for Guardian. And that is absolutely so critical, because you've got areas of government where billions, tens of billions of dollars are being spent, often not being spent very well. And it's absolutely critical that you've got journalists who actually understand these areas and can then report on those. So I think it's absolutely critical, and I think it's it is a cause for concern. But unfortunately, I don't think there's any way we're going to go back to that old system.
Yeah, we are trying. We are trying, I think, is the only, I think Steve's diagnosis is bang on. Particularly, in the Fin Review, if we think about that Fin Review Bureau that both you and I worked in, that had 12 people, and had basically every policy area covered. We are not in that resourcing environment anymore. I don't know how many people work in the Fin Bureau now, but I would guarantee it's half that what existed at that time. In my bureau, I have a bureau of 6, and we do try and allocate. Well, we have a specialist foreign and defence reporter, and we try and allocate policy areas amongst ourselves. I do a lot of writing on climate change. Paul Karp, one of my colleagues, does lots of great stuff on law and accountability. We are trying to do it, but we do not have the resources to do it in the same way that we did when I started in journalism. And, what do you lose as consumers? Well, you lose a degree of specialist knowledge and insight which informs policy debates which matter to you in terms of the quality of services and other things that are provided by governments. So it is a significant problem. While we are, absolutely working flat out around the clock to try and catch all those balls, news organisations do not have the resourcing that they had 20 years ago. That's the unvarnished truth.
Can I just add to that, because I think it's really important, a really important point. I'd say I would exhort us all to do better, and it's a common criticism of a lot of reporting now that there's too much emphasis on the horse race, if you like, and not enough emphasis on the policy. And there's always got to be a balance between the two, because they are interrelated and one affects the other. But I think we can and should do better as a kind of industry. The other thing is that I would add to that is that a lot of material now is available that used to only ever be available to journalists. Like you can see Hansard very quickly. You can see reports. You can see legal judgments, and not only can you see them, some people clearly do read them and do inform themselves about whatever the issue might be. A colleague of mine, Margaret Simons, has written an essay in Meanjin, the current edition of Meanjin, and she makes the point, she laments, a peeve, I think is her word for it, that in Victoria, which is where I'm from, when some reporters, even after there'd been a comprehensive Royal Commission done into the various failures in the early part of the COVID lockdown in Victoria, the hotel quarantine, and I won't rehearse them all again, we'll all get a headache again, but there's a report done, several chapters devoted to topic X and topic Y,
Well, thank you very much. I wasn't sure if anything could outdo Catherine's shoes tonight, but that conversation was fantastic. Can you join me all in thanking Matthew, Mark, Catherine, and in particular for Steve, who's dragged himself off his COVID bed. I know how that feels, so you can probably switch off and go back to bed very shortly. Ladies and gentlemen, please thank our panel.
Yeah, thanks very much. Have a great night.
I'm going to hold this book up for those people watching online, just in case you haven't spied the cover. For those of you who are here, Catherine and Matthew are going to be available to sign some of these upstairs, and if you haven't got it, it's available from our bookshop upstairs. I can hear people kicking themselves online right now thinking, I'm not at the library, how am I going to get this book? Well, we've got a shop that you can access online, so feel free to buy the book online as well. Thank you everybody for coming, thank you for your questions, thank you for braving the cold, and we hope to see you at the library again soon.